Cool. So, still good morning. Good morning, everyone. David Lomax. I head up the security engineering team at Abnormal in EMEA. I've been in cybersecurity in some form or other in the last sort of 25 plus years, as you can tell by how grey my hair's got now. In various forms, whether it be email security, where we are right now, previously, back in Barracuda, I was also doing network detection response as well, using AI and machine learning. I'm going to talk to you today about just the new ways that we're doing. I'm trying to make this not a sales pitch, so shout at me if it gets too salesy, but I'll try and keep it as even as possible. But just the new ways we're seeing that cyber criminals are targeting email, right? This is massively increased. I think all of you in the room, if you're here, know this is a problem that's really becoming quite a problem, right? You know, the most recent ones, all of the ones that now, weirdly, the government is attributing to the Chinese attacks recently, vast majority of them all started with phishing, right? Think about things like the MGM Grand Casino hack last year, Uber, all of them started with phishing emails. I think Deloitte say 91% of attacks that start in some form are in email based. And the simple reason is, right, they're going after the human. Humans make mistakes, right? It's the easiest thing to go after. If we look at how things have evolved, right, this has really sort of changed how we can do things with email. But, you know, we all used to have on-prem, you know, everything was very much the portcullis, close everything around us, everything felt good. You know, we're all massively moving, right? The cloud adoption, certainly during COVID and the pandemic times, meant so many people were moving to the cloud, certainly O365 and things like that. A lot of access through unmanaged devices, a lot of SaaS-based applications being used, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We know why we're going this way. We know some of the challenges it brings on moving into more cloud-based applications. So really, we talk about business email compromise. Why is that such a problem, right? You know, I can say with my hand on my heart, before I joined Abnormal a couple of years back, first thing I said was, email, that's done, right? Why would I want to go back and start working in email? I did that. I was employee number 8 back in Barracuda back in the early 2000s. It seemed like a good idea. I realized quite quickly things have changed. Things have evolved on, right? The old spam, the old malicious emails, right? It's not that simple anymore. They're way more complicated than that. The social engineering that goes behind these things is really advanced. And actually, if you look at things in terms of how much money attackers and other people use, right? The ROI or return on investment for those attackers is hugely high in phishing emails and scamming emails, whatever it might be. You know, certainly with business email compromise, think about things like invoice fraud or other things along those lines, right? There's a huge amount of money to be made there, and they regularly do. Socially engineering is very effective, right? We all put a lot of information about ourselves out on the internet now. Things like LinkedIn, things like other socials you might use. There's a lot of data about us, which means I can send a very credible email that makes me think I know about you, I know what you're doing, I know where you work. You know, it sounds very legitimate. And the problem with that, the traditional defenses we're looking at, think about secure email gateways, the traditional things we've all been doing, right? They're kind of using that known bad approach. You know, I'm going to look at this email, bad IPs, DKIM, SPF, DMARC, whatever it might be, any of those looking bad. If they are, I'll get rid of it. The problem with that is email and textual-based communications, the relationship's much harder to glean out of just looking at, you know, one email. If you think about secure email gateways, it's sort of a conveyor belt as an MTA, picks up the email, has a look through, anything bad I can see in there, that known bad approach. If not, pass it on. The problem is you get an email, and I'll show you some examples in a minute, that's very simple, just text-based. It might be just the preamble to get into a phishing or an attack or invoice fraud, whatever it might be. There's nothing for them to latch onto. There's nothing bad about it. You know, I think as an organization, I don't think I've ever worked for a company where the POV or POC, whatever you call it now, has been more impactful, right? You know, the way, and I'll talk about the way we approach is via the API directly into O365. We can and will only show you emails that have got past all your existing defenses, right? So it's got through a SEG, it's got through Microsoft, it has landed in a user's inbox. And normally that's a big eye opener for CISOs and security people. And we look at the cost associated with it, right? FBI report, I was actually at an event in Dublin 3 weeks ago now, where one of the FBI team was actually over there talking at this event. And they were all sort of steering the conversation around malware and everything. And I pointed out to this individual, I was like, yeah, if you look at your report you were talking about from the FBI, actually, business email compromise is way bigger problem than malware and ransomware. Get my lips around that one. But that's all we hear about. We hear a lot about malware and ransomware. And the reason being if you're compromised with malware or ransomware, GDPR rules dictate you have to tell the world it happened, right? If someone screws up and pays an invoice for 10,000 euros or pounds, whatever it might be, as long as the organization can absorb that cost, you just move on. It's embarrassing, it's painful. But if you look at it, now granted these are numbers for North America, $2.7 billion was lost to business email compromise. If you dig through that report, ransomware and malware was about 150 million, 190 million. So in terms of cost to businesses, it's a big, big problem. When you look at the numbers, right? Overall, since we've been recording this, since 2016, 43 billion has been lost to business email compromise. The average loss per attack is about $125,000. And certainly in 2020, when this report came out, it got up by nearly 50%. The interesting thing is last year, Q1 last year, for the most recent data I have, it's gone up again by 50%. So this is very effective, very lucrative for the attackers, which is why they keep using it, right? There's lots of nation state that are doing this as well, don't get me wrong. It's a very effective way to get into it. And the problem is, remember, if you compromise through a phishing email, you could potentially have all of your Google Workspace, you could have all of O365 environment. The login you then have has a lot of potential to the attackers. I know this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. We all remember the Nigerian prince ones, right? It's getting much worse. These simple attacks that came through back in the day, which were just, send out 4 million of these, someone might send their bank details through, right? It might happen. In fact, it did happen, or this wouldn't have existed, right? They're really starting to change. The sophistication of these attacks are really increasing. And that sort of helped twofold, right? One of them is ability to use tools like this. LinkedIn, ChatGPT, Grammarly. Now, I don't know about you guys, I'm one of the people that everyone talks about ChatGPT or large language model AI and all the rest of it. It's not a bad thing. In reality, the stuff we see very few emails that are being generated by ChatGPT. What it is used for, and it's very powerful for that, is using that tool to say, I want to find out about David Lomax. I'm going to say he talked today at this event about this topic, right? You can get all this information very quickly from ChatGPT, and then you can fashion a very convincing email. Like we actually, we created an API tool, one of the engineering team, as a sort of side project. And what it did, it allowed us to go, Tim Bentley, our VP in the Asia Pacific office, when I go and did a load of research on him, ChatGPT said, Tim talked at this event in Sydney about this topic, and it helped you go talk about these things if you're building it. ChatGPT, in its defense, is quite good. If you say, write me a phishing email, it won't do it. It'll say, no, that's bad. If you ask ChatGPT to write me an email that would make someone click a link, it'll do that for you, though. So, you've got to be very careful with these tools. Like I said, not seeing a huge amount of it in the wild, but it's incredibly useful. Like the one we did against Tim, it was a nice little email that came up and said, hey, Tim, saw you talking at blah, 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 this event in Sydney about this topic. Really enjoy this. I think thought leaders like yourself, massaging their ego, are really interesting. I'm doing a white paper on this topic. Maybe you could have a look at it and see what you think. Click the link, right? Now, this is someone who works at Abnormal, right? First thing they were like was, oh, looks legit. Now, luckily, we caught it and we flagged it and told them all the rest of it because we'd done it internally. But they're very, very clever at doing things like that. You can collect data very quickly. The real reason I don't think we're seeing a huge amount of ChatGPT, I'm not telling you not to worry about it. I'm saying right now it's not a big issue. It's way more complicated to do that, right? Using ChatGPT, using all these APIs, paying for those APIs, don't need to. It's so successful with just collecting data and building emails. They just don't need to yet. I'm sure it will come. We were at our sales kickoff a couple of weeks back. One of the things one of our founders said, and I totally agree with them, where we're using AI to be quicker to defend, the attackers are clearly going to start using large language models, generative AI, to be quicker at sending attacks, right? We've seen just with the onslaught of cloud, right? The old days of having bad links, bad attachments, that kind of thing. I can generate a new link for every single one of you in this audience that will go to a different place, right? Be perfectly fine. Safe links won't detect it. URL defense won't detect it because it's a perfectly valid link. Follow that on with things like Grammarly, right? The days of a badly spelt email in whatever language you're talking about, don't need to worry about that now. We can generate it perfectly good. It will check all my grammar, check all my spelling. Looks very legitimate. So these tools, as benign as they look, right, are incredibly powerful and useful to the attackers. If we look at this next example, now some of these seem very basic, and I'll explain to you why. But if you look at this is basically an Italian version that we'd seen. And what it's actually saying is, tell me how much money we owe you. Very few organizations won't say, yeah, you owe us this, right? Why wouldn't you? The problem is it's a very clever way of getting into starting business email threats, right? You go, you pretend to be a supplier they talk to, you say, tell us how much money we owe you, you send them past due invoices, a nice remittance report. If they do that to everyone in your supply chain and all the different people you do business with, they then end up knowing company A owes company B, who owes company C. And what they then start doing is fashioning themselves in the middle of those conversations and going, oh, we know you owe us X, we're trying to consolidate for year end, we're changing bank details. If you pay in 30 days, we're going to knock 5% off the value of that invoice, we'll do you a deal. Most companies go, yeah, that's great, because the credibility is there, right? They know every line item of every invoice of money you owe them. Why wouldn't you pay them? Hopefully you have processes in place, which means they can't change bank details very easily, but it does happen, right? So things like this, which seem really benign, can be the start of a really big problem, right? Because they're getting very involved in your day-to-day business, and when they start sending in these emails, they sound very credible because you've given them all the data. And things like that are very difficult for traditional email security to block, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's text only. In fact, it's in Italian text, so are you going to see it in some tools? The sender's perfectly valid, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, all green because it's coming from a perfectly valid sender. In my experience, 99.9% of the time, no matter what security you've got right now, that will go through because there's nothing wrong with it. And that's what really hurts a lot of these other security tools out there. You need to be able to find a way to block that. I'll talk about it in a minute, but just I wanted to highlight the fact it looks really simple. This could actually be a myriad of things. If we look at the next one, for example, as everyone who's been in email, have you seen these coming around, I want to change my payroll before the next date? Yeah, huge one went around at the moment. I know they use direct deposit, very American term, and I know this one's got a bit of a weird accent above one of the letters in there. But you'd be amazed how wildly successful these things are, right? It's absolutely crazy. I've seen so many people that have gone, we won't fall for this, we've got a process in place, which is great. Everyone should have a process, don't get me wrong. Unfortunately, processes typically have humans in the middle, which make mistakes. In an example, I was talking to a customer about this one. We went through it, we showed them this email had come in, explained we would have blocked it. And they're like, yeah, but it doesn't really matter. And then we showed them the response. So someone in HR responded back saying, we can't change your payroll. You have to click this link to go to the internal app to do it. Payroll gets run on the 24th of the month. Has to be done before then. They're like, see, they followed the process. Not a problem. I said, you're right, absolutely. Firstly, they spent time doing that, so it's a waste of their time actually sending that email. More importantly, though, if I'm a smart hacker, do you know what I'm going to use that intel for? I'm going to respond back on the 20th of the month saying, I've tried to use system X, can't get into it. I've only just joined the company. I know payroll gets run on the 25th. My mortgage isn't going to get taken out unless you help me. All that credible data then hits the HR people. They go, oh, maybe I should change it for them. I've even had one where they actually went through it and they went, see, we'd never do this. The CFO sent an email in. No one wanted to upset the CFO and started manually changing their payroll. Right? The one person you shouldn't be changing stuff for. So again, these things are very benign. It's very difficult for typical or traditional email security to detect these things because there's just nothing in there. There's no bad things to look at. Even when you take it to the next level, when you start thinking about these multi-step phishing emails, right? That first link is fine. It's not on any safe links, it's not on any block lists, it's absolutely valid because it's taking you, if I get it up there, to a SharePoint. You know, perfectly valid SharePoint. It's not going to show up on any block list, nothing wrong with it. Embedded in there, you might not be able to see, is another link. I'll go and view the PDF in there. Click on that PDF, next thing it takes you to is an O365 login. And these are where the real problems start, right? What you see here is, this is probably a pretty bad one, right? It's not a particularly clever one of doing this. We're seeing a huge amount now where they'll host a reverse proxy, if you've ever heard of evil proxy and things like that, right? They'll use these in things like Cloudflare or Akamai, because you can't block all those IPs, everyone uses them. It'll then reverse proxy to the real O365 login. Everything works. If I go through it, even my phone will go, you need to do two-factor, and I'll do the two-factor. Everything's perfect. There's no way they would know it's any different. What's incredibly useful for the attackers then is not only have they phished your credentials, they also get the session token, which allows them access to your email and all O365 apps for as long as conditional access allows them. So that's deliberately why they're doing it now, is to get past that two-factor authentication. And we see this time and time again where these things are happening. We spend an awful lot of time looking at things we call account takeover. I'm not really talking about it in here, but it's basically looking for those suspicious sign-in events as well as malicious emails. You've probably seen in O365, you get loads of these lovely alerts, or M365 now, sorry, too fast to travel, suspicious sign-in. I know lots of CISOs and SOC teams tune those down a bit because they're just really noisy. People travel a lot. If you can take a signal like that from Microsoft, but also then leverage on top of that the fact that we know this individual, yes, has signed in Hong Kong and that's unusual, but we also know they've never sent an email from that location or to that location. Add those two things together, the efficacy of that is really important, which means we can make a much more targeted decision. The supply chain side of things is also another big compromise, right? We've seen lots of people trying to target supply chain. Lots of organizations we speak to are very concerned about this. We do a really clever thing we call vendor base. So we profile all of the companies you do business with. We profile that relationship. We know who you talk to at that vendor. We know who talks to them internally. We know typically the cadence of invoices being paid. We know bank details that they're normally paying. So we can learn all that kind of behavior to really look for what's going on. This first example here is talking about, this is actually a supplier here that's been compromised, that's been using phishing emails to go through. What's interesting about this, so if you think about the one on the left right now, this is the one that came from a supplier. It was a basic phishing attack where you click on that and you get some sort of compromised thing. Up until recently, all the big players had no answer for QR codes. They just went, well, you can block them if you want this image. And it's been a real big problem. What I always like to point out is we were blocking these early spring last year. We didn't change anything. It just behaviorally or abnormally, we'd never seen that type of activity before. It's not normal for you to do that. We're typically looking anywhere between 40 and 90,000 signals. And it's a really important point. If you speak to any data scientists, machine learning, AI experts, the first thing they'll tell you, if you want a good model, I need a lot of well-structured, well-labeled data. I'll build you a good model then, but without that, it's really hard. Think about traditional defenses, the SEG, right? They only see north to south. They just see those incoming messages. If you plug in via the API, as we do, you get access to all that data, right? There's lots of companies that say they plug in via the API, but they use all kinds of transport rules. But if you're purely a graph API play, you can see all those messages. We get to see all mail filter rule changes, all the logins, and all the kinds of things which can really add credibility. One of the things our founders were fanatical about was efficacy. We don't want to be guessing, right? If you look at the phishing simulation tools, worldwide, maybe your organizations vary, but worldwide, the top 5, it's around 25% of your employees still click the link, right? No matter how well you've trained them, how much time you've spent on it. And I always say this, it's not because they're stupid. They're probably very good at finance, design, engineering, whatever it might be. They're not cybersecurity experts. I also say there's 100% emails I've seen that I probably would have clicked, right? They look really good. I've done this for a long time. They're very, very good. They're very, very difficult to see some of these things. So you don't want to be making users make decisions. If you think about things like a quarantine is basically the vendor you chose to do email security going, I don't know the answer. Hey, user, you make the decision. And like to my previous point, users don't make great decisions because they just don't know. So things like QR codes that have been going around, the interesting thing I pointed out here is on the left is the one that we saw from that supplier. On the right at the top is actually a DocuSign one. I'm sure every one of you has seen some sort of DocuSign phishing email come in. The original ones, if you look, had a button, you click it, and a link. They clearly, maybe it's a different ATP that were doing these things, they went, these QR codes work really well. And you can see they've evolved now to their DocuSign ones now have a QR code. Literally the only thing we changed in our platform was to extract the URL from the QR code so you could see it in the portal if you want to be able to do something with it. The one thing is I get frustrated with a lot of people when they go, oh, no, it's really good that you can block all this, it's all automated, it's great. Can we pull threat intelligence out of that? I'm like, you're kind of missing the point. No threat intelligence would have blocked this to start with, so how is that going to be helpful if we give you that data? Absolutely they can, and they can pull it out. But I think it's just remembering the reason we do what we do is a bit like, think about the evolution of endpoint, right? We used to download, we had an AV engine, we downloaded .dat files every day. We all felt pretty good about it until most of us in the security world went, yeah, but that's like looking for a car accident in your rearview mirror. These things did happen, probably not going to happen tomorrow. The zero-day attacks are a real problem still because they might even just be targeting me as an organization. which is why we've now evolved to EDR platforms that are behavioral based, right? We don't care what it is, we care what it does. Same with the email space, but the hardest thing about that is, if it's just textual based, how do you get this right? Okay, so this one's an example I talked about a minute ago where it's a supplier that's been compromised. So one of your suppliers has absolutely been compromised, so the email will be coming from their domain. One of the hardest things we've seen quite a few times, I think it's the next example, is if they do compromise you and you're using cloud-based email, Google or Microsoft, you can then often respond to an existing email thread you're already having with someone about a conversation. So that individual has no idea that suddenly this is an attacker that's responding, not the end user at this company. And then it adds, again, more credibility because it's coming from that person I'm having a conversation with. All they're saying is, we're just changing bank details. You know, in the States, you remember last year or the end of the year before, when Silicon Valley Bank went, oof, there was a huge amount of emails going around saying, oh, we've just had to change our bank, Silicon Valley's collapsed. We need to update our banking details. A huge amount of money got lost in the US over that, where companies were just suddenly getting these emails going, oh, that looks legit because they have gone under, let's change all the banking details for them. And in this case, they're clearly just saying, we want to add a discount if you send it through now. You know, again, the next one I talked about, convincing language. It looks very legitimate. In this case, it is responding to an existing email thread. It's very, very hard to protect against those things. Third-party applications, well, that's another thing that's really important. You know, you'll see there's a technique used by hackers called sideloading. So you can kind of disregard some of these things, but if you think about MGM Grand, the attack that was there recently, right? You know, we were actually over there recently for our event in Vegas, and I went there, and I took a picture, and I didn't put it in the slide I should have done, of the floor, and is it 1,200 square meters of electronic gaming in that casino? Every screen was dark. Just turned the lot off. And it actually started from a link sent through WhatsApp. Someone clicked on a WhatsApp, low-level thing, clicked on the link, got phished. That low-level user then, they'd actually had from the dark web other users that had been compromised, but the passwords weren't valid anymore. So they took this low-level user, got into the system, moved laterally, pretended to be someone that was slightly more important, and actually got them to change their password over the phone, saying they couldn't get in, but they need to do some sort of system change. So it all started with, you know, SMS phishing to real phishing to escalation. What then happened was they kind of got lucky that the person they secondly phished was quite high up in the IT organization. They ended up finding credentials that got them into AWS, which allowed them to go in and just shut everything down and delete all their EC2 instances. So, you know, and if you think about that one, I always love talking about this one. The MGM Grand one, $8 million a day for 10 days is how much it cost them. So, all right, every company's different, but that's a hell of an impact through a very simple phishing email that came through originally. You know, there's lots of things that are coming up on here. You can see the news that we talk about. The next one I think is really interesting, which is News Corp. You know, this happened a couple of years ago now, but in 2020, attackers on Azure, they basically installed another application in M365. And this is what I was talking about, this sideloading. Often, instead of trying to phish you, they'll get you to say, oh, do you not want to use Grammarly, or this tool is really fast and efficient in your email, make it really good. No one thinks twice about installing a third-party plugin or an add-in or something. I think it's just for them. But often you don't realize that these apps that you're installing in O365 had read-write access to your email, right? What actually happened in here, they installed an application that had right across the entire platform. What it basically was doing was if any journalist was saying something that wasn't positive to China, they were backhauling all that data across to wherever it was in China and getting that data. It was in there for 2 years before anyone detected. So some of these applications, you know, one of the things we do on our platform, and I can't show you now, but I would if I can if you want to see this, is app-based. So we look at all the applications in O365 and we just surface to them and which ones are high risk. Because often, the amount of times I've done a demo with a customer or a POV with a customer, showed them this, and they're like, I'm like, first of all, you've got all these applications that, according to Microsoft, don't exist anymore. They haven't got a valid vendor ID or anything. They might have been installed years ago, but they're not in Azure, they're not anywhere there, but they've got read-write access to your mailbox. What are they doing? But I've certainly had CISOs going, we haven't used that app for years. Why has it still got access to our email? So it's really difficult sometimes to see those things all in one place. But you know, this one for News Corp, they genuinely didn't have a long time didn't have a knowledge for a very, very long time that this has happened. So, what do we need to be doing to do these things? This is the only bit I'll talk salesy to you, but I'll try and do it at a high-level topic. So, the reality is, as we've talked about, things are evolving. The point of attack now has dramatically increased. Socially engineering is very successful, right? We've seen the numbers, 43 billion, the amount of account takeovers that have gone up, the cost of these compromised accounts is dramatically increased. When you're looking at platforms, if you're talking about email security, what you really need to be thinking about is these sort of 3 areas you should always be looking at, right? They need to be aware of identity, not just email. They need to know who these people are, what they typically do, how they behave from an identity perspective. One of the big things we're looking at is trying to unify account takeover across, as of RSA, a bit of a spoiler alert, RSA in May, we're just about to launch our unified account takeover. We can plug into lots of other SaaS-based applications. So if you get a weird login to Workday or whatever it might be, or Salesforce, if you can leverage the intelligence like I talked about with the Microsoft Too Fast to Travel, you can then say this is a weird thing over here, but Salesforce on its own or Workday over here on its own don't have enough intelligence to know is that bad. If you can leverage a lot of behavioral stuff from email, you can quickly identify that. So it's really important to be aware of the identity. More importantly, context aware. And this is probably the holy grail. This is the hard thing. One of the really exciting things about Abnormal that drew me here originally was half the founders that founded Abnormal are not security people, right? They came from the ad tech space, Twitter, Google, Facebook, Amazon, which seems kind of an oxymoron. But if all of us know, if I go to the internet today and write an email or search engine, holidays in Marbella, the internet is going to advertise holidays in Marbella absolutely everywhere to me because that's just how they make their money. How's that done? By ad tech people, right? Sanjay, one of our founders, I remember I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago and he goes, look, I remember when we sold our company to Twitter, it's like, what do we do next? I was like, do I really want to go to my deathbed knowing I made an advert slightly higher on Twitter? It's very effective, very clever. The maths was great, but it's not particularly effective. Using that ad tech, if you want anyone to tell you whether textually in an email it's bad, those are the people that you want. People that can write models to look at this. Things like natural language understanding, natural language processing to know, I know what the intent of this message is. People often ask me, do you rewrite URLs? Do you sandbox attachments? And all these kinds of things. Yeah, we absolutely can sandbox and we can trawl links. But in 95% of all emails we block, it's because of the intent of the message. Why would I have clicked this link? Why would have I opened this attachment? It's that intent and understanding the context around it. It's very difficult to get this right. But what makes it easier now is with cloud-based email, we've got a lot more data about individuals to better process that and come up with it. Again, we don't want to quarantine. We don't want users making decisions. One of the biggest obstacles sometimes SOC teams have is they just come from that, I'm used to the IOC world. I know how that works. I want to do that. How does this help? Once they've had it in place, like we were at Gartner last year, both Maersk and A.S. Watson, so A.S. Watson's the owner of Superdrug in the UK, they both stood up at that event and said they managed to repurpose a full-time headcount who isn't looking at this stuff anymore. They just let us do what we need to do. And I think that really is based on that. So being aware of that context, being aware of what that risk is, so the relationships, do you know it's a vendor? Do I trust that vendor? Have I spoke to them about it? Does this individual normally talk to this individual about invoices? If so, what's the cadence? Is it normally this month that we change invoice stuff? That's really, really important. Some of the ways you do these things can be different across all things, but being able to do all of that and have that context gives you that high fidelity alert. Just get rid of the email. I don't need someone to look at it. I don't need to quarantine it. Just get rid of it. That's me in a nutshell. I've got 5 minutes left, so any questions from anyone? Happy to take any questions. Or tell me I'm wrong. I'm okay with that too. Yes. Sorry, thank you. Oh, yeah.
I can shout. If I would go through the court, they always shout at me if I don't do that. It's my one job.
He's been sitting waiting, come on. It doesn't amplify you, it's just recording, so yeah.
Oh. Sorry for the bumping.
So from a security point of view, you mentioned that you link into the Graph API. I kind of freak out a little bit about systems and services hooking into the Graph API. There are various tools that want God access. What kind of permissions are abnormal looking for? And just thinking about supply chain risks, are you a threat to us if you need that much access to data?
It's a good question. Data privacy comes up all the time, and in terms of security and all that kind of stuff, there's about 8 to 10 things that we request. Obviously, we need to be able to read email, read alerts, things like that. The only real right permissions we ask are to move emails. And the reason that is, if you want us to remediate and delete them, we need those permissions to be able to do it. One thing we totally agree with you, and we take it very seriously, is data privacy, right? If you go into mainland Europe, this can be incredibly complicated. You know, in places like Germany and Austria, they have as much rights on their work email as they do personal email, right? You can be very careful with the workers' councils. We deliberately, the way we work via the API means is we read that purely via our enterprise app. We don't keep any copies of good emails. If it's a good email, it stays in O365. We read it into memory, we make a decision, is it good or bad? If it's good, it remains there. If it's bad, we take the action and then keep a copy in the portal so you can see it. But that's only malicious emails. So from a data privacy perspective, not a problem. We are completely GDPR compliant with SOC 2 Type 2. We've got EU residency, which most people are concerned about. So, you know, we actually, one thing I really love about our CISO is he created, there's a thing called security.abnormal security, which gives all the certifications, all the information, how we do password, all the stuff you normally get asked to do. So yeah, it's a good question. In theory, potentially, yes, we're a threat to you. But the only reality is if we were ever compromised, you only ever access to that one email in memory at that time. We're fully pen tested and all the stuff that's associated with it. So no more of a threat than Microsoft is, if that makes sense.
We don't trust those either.
Exactly. And I don't blame you. It made me laugh when I picked up this lectern and it went, Huawei share. And I was like, isn't that just on by default with Huawei devices? Any other questions? Sorry, over
there. You mentioned earlier on about you're not seeing much emails being generated with ChatGPT. How do you tell if an email's been generated by ChatGPT at scale, like with the amount of emails you're seeing? What do you guys do to look?
Good question. So how do we look for emails that are being generated using LLMs? The simple answer is you can almost reverse it back on itself. So it's not in this slide, but it is another deck where I talk about this, is it AI or human? You can reverse those emails back in and find out what's the probability this was generated by AI. And what we do is we've got a whole engine that looks at it and goes, if I was to generate this message, what's the probability an LLM would use this wording? And you can look at it and go, 98% of this is perfectly what LLMs would create. So that's what we're doing, is we'll reverse it back on itself. So we're watching that constantly to see how much of that goes up and down in the industry. But like I said, it's a fraction of the emails we're seeing at the moment. But yeah, exactly for that reason, we have this now, part of our engine is to look for, has this been auto-generated? Got to be careful with that, and in perfect honesty there, right? We're going to see a lot of things as Copilot move forward where emails are generated by ChatGPT. So it's good, you've got to be careful with that balance, but it's something we're constantly monitoring. But yeah, it is easy to detect them right now.
Hi, my name is Karthik. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it doesn't amplify you, so I'll just have to listen really well.
Okay, so my question is around, you talked about multi-step phishing campaigns, right, with OneDrive. So I was just curious, how can you have a suspicious link within a corporate intranet? Like you said, you go to SharePoint, which is within intranet, which is highly secure, and within intranet you go to a link in OneDrive, which is again within the corporate intranet. How can you have phishing link in there, right? I was just curious about it.
Oh, I'm with you. Okay, so correct me, I'll just repeat that one. The question is, how can you have a SharePoint which has a malicious link inside? Doesn't mean it's your SharePoint. Could be any SharePoint. The one I was showing you there was just a SharePoint that was publicly accessible. I hear what you're saying. If it's internal, chances are probably not. It shouldn't be in there. Most of these things, what they'll do is they'll get a SharePoint that might be, let's say your company's Smith & Wesson LLP. They'll register Smith & Wesson LLP. So when you get a SharePoint with that name in it, you go, oh, it must be our SharePoint. It isn't, but it looks perfectly valid. Sorry. So yeah, it doesn't mean it's their SharePoint. Appreciate everyone's time. We are up on the Cyber Vigilance stand if you want to have a conversation with us, but thank you very much.